Open the stupid gate. It's for the whole neighborhood. That's what she screamed at me, like my family's cabin was some kind of public park. I was standing there with the newsletter in my hand, still smelling like burnt coffee, trying to process how my private getaway suddenly turned into an official retreat for 100 strangers. The whole thing started Thursday morning when I found that newsletter crammed into my mailbox like some kind of official decree. I'm reading about a community retreat at what they're calling the Lakeside Cabin. My lakeside cabin. The one I spent 3 years rebuilding with my own hands, turning my grandfather's old fishing shack into something worth being proud of. The newsletter even had a QR code for rideshare coordination, like they'd planned this whole thing down to parking arrangements. I felt this cold knot form in my stomach. My cabin, and they dare print it as community location. The weight of what this could mean legally started hitting me. If someone gets hurt on my property during an event I never authorized, my insurance might not cover it. I could lose everything I've worked for. I walked up to the cabin that afternoon and just stood there looking at the steel pipe gate I installed last year. Farm style, solid construction, the kind that says private property without being rude about it. I pulled out my phone and scanned that QR code. The page was completely blank, just a white screen with a loading icon that never finished loading. I started laughing, but it wasn't funny. They thought I was stupid enough to fall for their nonsense. So I locked the gate. Not just the regular lock, either. I went to the hardware store and bought tamper-proof security wire with a serial number, the kind that shows if anyone's tried to cut it. But locking the gate wasn't enough. I needed to know who exactly thought they had the authority to volunteer my property for community events. I drove back home and pulled out my fire safe, spreading the papers out on my kitchen table. Property deed, survey maps, insurance papers, the whole stack of legal proof that this place belongs to me and nobody else. The next morning, I drove back to the cabin with a folding table and a thick manila folder. I set up right outside the gate with event host authorization and personal liability commitment written in big letters across the top. Inside, I'd prepared copies of the property deed, survey map, and a blank form with spaces for signatures. Simple concept: whoever authorized this event could sign their name and accept legal responsibility for insurance, permits, and any injuries that might occur. I sat in my truck for about an hour watching neighbors walk by. Mrs. Henderson from across the street spent a long time looking at the survey map, tracing the property lines with her finger. The confusion on their faces was obvious. If the HOA wanted to make announcements about my property in their newsletter, they had already made it public. I was just asking for some accountability. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to investigate that QR code situation. I checked the HOA website, meeting minutes, everything. Nothing. I even called the company that printed their newsletter. If it's showing a blank page, either the link is broken or they never set up a destination, the rep said. They'd created a QR code for rideshare coordination without actually setting up a working website. Either incredibly disorganized or they'd rushed this announcement without thinking it through. Friday morning started with Mrs. Henderson knocking on my front door before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. She was holding the HOA newsletter and looking more upset than I'd ever seen her. Evan, my daughter handles real estate law down in the city. I sent her a picture of this newsletter last night, and she called me back within an hour. She says this is classic authority overreach, and you've got every right to protect your property. Mrs. Henderson had been in the neighborhood longer than anyone, a retired paralegal who'd seen enough legal disputes to know trouble when it was brewing. Her validation made me feel less like I was overreacting and more like I was protecting myself from something expensive. But she wasn't done. She showed me a text from her daughter. She wants to know if you've documented everything. The newsletter announcement, the QR code that doesn't work, any communication from the HOA about using your property. After Mrs. Henderson left, I decided to take a systematic approach. I started with Mr. June next door, who invited me in for coffee and pulled out a folder of his own. I've been keeping track of HOA overreach for 2 years, he said, spreading out meeting minutes and email printouts. This isn't Cynthia's first time making announcements without board approval. Cynthia Pierce, HOA president, apparently had a pattern of treating other people's property like it belonged to the association. Mr. June showed me emails going back 18 months documenting unilateral decisions the board later had to walk back. Political sign bans, tree planting requirements, unauthorized fees. She always frames it like she's protecting property values, but she never follows proper procedures, Mr. June explained. By evening, I had witness statements from 5 families documenting a 2-year pattern of HOA authority overreach. Each incident showed the same pattern: announce authority you don't have, hope people comply, back down only when faced with legal challenges. But the real shock came Sunday morning with a phone call from Rebecca Shaw, the neighbor who did freelance accounting. "Evan, I accidentally got copied on some emails I probably wasn't supposed to see. There are vendors involved in this cabin event. Real vendors with real invoices who expect to get paid using the neighborhood name. Someone had committed the neighborhood to over $1,500 in vendor services. Portable toilets, catering trays, folding tables, tent rental, group transportation. All scheduled for delivery to my cabin address. The vendor situation made this about more than property rights. I called my insurance agent for a face-to-face conversation about event liability. Sarah pulled up my homeowner's policy and walked me through coverage exclusions. Commercial events, even unofficial ones, create liability traps that policies don't always cover," she explained. "If vendors provide services at your property for an unauthorized event and someone gets injured, you could face liability for both the injury and the vendor obligations." She calculated the potential exposure for my specific situation: 100 people, multiple vendor services, no permits, no valid contracts. You could be looking at invoices, penalties, and cancellation charges that easily reach 6 figures. You could lose your house, your savings, everything you've worked for. Monday morning brought vendor calls confirming Rebecca's warning. Portable toilet company asking for delivery confirmation and payment authorization. Van rental company with a declined HOA account number. Catering service wanting final headcount for 100 people. Each vendor represented hundreds of dollars in committed services, and none had received payment authorization. Tuesday morning arrived with the sound of multiple vehicles approaching my cabin. The day the community retreat was supposed to happen. I'd been awake since dawn, sitting with coffee and the updated authorization form, watching the sunrise and preparing for whatever was about to unfold. The first vehicle was a silver SUV with Maryland plates, followed by a white minivan and 2 more cars. As they approached my gate, I could see people checking their phones, probably looking for GPS confirmation. The SUV driver rolled down his window. "Excuse me, is this where the community retreat is supposed to be? We've got a QR code for rideshare coordination, but the gate's locked." I walked over with my authorization form folder. These were actual families who'd planned their morning around attending an event at my property. I felt genuinely terrible about disappointing them, but I couldn't ignore the financial reality. "This is private property," I explained calmly. "According to vendor invoices, whoever authorized this event needs to accept personal financial responsibility for over $1,500 in vendor services, plus potential 6-figure liability exposure." More vehicles arrived while I was explaining the situation. Soon there were 8 cars with families getting out to ask about entry procedures. Parents with children, elderly couples with folding chairs, teenagers with coolers. That's when Cynthia Pierce finally made her appearance. She drove up in a black luxury sedan, getting out with the confident stride of someone who expected this confrontation to go her way. "Evan, you're being completely unreasonable about this," she said loud enough for the gathered families to hear. "The association has authority to organize community events." I handed Cynthia the authorization form with the updated vendor calculations. The portable toilet company called yesterday asking for payment authorization. The van rental service needs a valid credit card because the HOA account was declined. According to vendors, whoever signs as the event organizer accepts personal liability for all of it. I watched her face change as she read through the financial obligations. Her confident expression shifted to concern as she saw the liability numbers and vendor contact details. The crowd was listening, and parents started asking their own questions about insurance coverage and permit requirements. Cynthia stood there reading the form for what felt like 5 minutes, her hands visibly shaking as she reviewed the numbers. Van rental over $400, plus delivery fees for portable facilities, plus personal liability for any unpaid services involving 100 people. I don't have authority to accept this level of financial risk, she finally said, handing the form back to me. But you had enough authority to announce my cabin as the location in the HOA newsletter. I asked, not confrontationally, just pointing out the logical inconsistency. You had authority to commit the neighborhood to vendor services, but not authority to accept financial responsibility for the obligations that came with those decisions. Cynthia didn't answer directly, but I could see the recognition in her eyes. She'd created a situation requiring someone to accept significant financial liability, but she'd never considered who would actually be responsible for the vendor payments. The families started coordinating their departure without dramatic confrontations. Parents were talking about liability issues and permit requirements, several mentioning their own household budgets and the limits of covering unauthorized events. Within 30 minutes, the caravan of vehicles was heading back down the country road. Wednesday morning brought a call from the portable toilet company. We have a delivery scheduled for your address this morning, but no one's returning our calls about payment authorization. Our drivers already loaded the equipment, and we need confirmation of who's responsible for the $300 delivery fee. Similar calls followed throughout the day. Van rental, catering service, tent company, all demanding payment for services they'd been hired to provide without valid authorization. Total vendor obligations exceeded $2,400, with multiple companies threatening collection action. By Thursday, I realized this needed professional resolution. I drove to the county courthouse to research similar cases. What I found made me understand that Cynthia's behavior could have consequences far more serious than vendor payments. The legal precedents were clear: HOA officers who exceeded their authority faced personal financial exposure. I found cases where presidents were held personally liable for tens of thousands in damages when they made unauthorized property decisions. Armed with this research, I proposed a mediation session at Mrs. Henderson's house, with her daughter facilitating as a neutral attorney. The settlement we negotiated focused on education rather than punishment. Cynthia agreed to accept personal responsibility for all vendor payments with a structured payment plan. She also agreed to draft a formal acknowledgement that her cabin announcement had exceeded HOA authority and committed to participating in creating educational guidelines about property rights and association powers. 6 months later, the impact of our resolution extended beyond my neighborhood. The property rights guidelines we developed had been adopted by 3 other communities in the county. Professional private property signage was installed at my road entrance with clear boundary markers. Standing at my cabin gate now, watching the same lake my grandfather once fished, I feel the weight finally lift. What started as one outrageous announcement turned into a lesson that forced everyone here to face what property rights and responsibility really mean. Maybe the real lesson is that a locked gate can protect more than land. It can protect sanity, too.